I have always wanted to be a writer. Even as a small child, I wanted to be a storyteller. I think the influence of my father plays a part here. He never read to we kids at bedtime, but told stories that he'd made up. So I was seeing someone use his imagination to create characters and a sense of place and a storyline from a very early age. There were always books in the house. I think that matters. I used to teach creative writing to adults, and I'd say a good 30 or 40% of them were not readers, but wanted to be writers. So always books in the house, and growing up on a farm and not seeing other kids after school, I was a daydreamer. I spent a lot of time by myself, and for whatever reason, I have always wanted to write. I used to write for school, then later university magazines. Did a BA at Adelaide and later a Masters at Monash. When I should have been doing my university work, I was writing short stories and sending them to literary magazines. The first one got published and I got a cheque for $100, and I thought, that's it, at last I'm a writer. But the other stories soon after that got rejected, but that's pretty standard for a new writer. But bit by bit I built up a portfolio of short stories, and on the strength of these was awarded a creative writing scholarship to Stanford University in California. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me as a young or new writer. We met for 2 hours twice a week to workshop the short stories or novel chapters we were working on, and I learned very quickly I was writing badly and knew nothing about writing, but by the end of that year I had honed my skills very well, and these short stories I wrote that year in America I later collected in a book called Approaches. So my first publication was a collection of short stories. When I came back to Australia, I started teaching creative writing because there were no courses available. Roughly at the same time I started teaching at Adult Education. Carmel Bird, the Melbourne writer, was also teaching. Now you can do creative writing courses quite widely around Victoria, but back then there were no courses. So I taught part-time for the next 10 years, and that helped to develop good work habits in the sense that all my teaching was in the afternoon and evenings, so I had only the mornings to work in. So it took a year or two to develop good work habits, but now I can go to the desk whether I feel inspired or not. I treat it as a job. And for the 10 years that I was teaching part-time, I wrote several books. But about 15 years ago, I quit teaching to become a full-time writer. And I've published about 40 odd books now, including children's fiction, teenage fiction, crime fiction, literary fiction, history textbooks, creative writing handbooks, and so on. I do make a living as a writer. I'm one of the few Australian writers who does, but it's a patchy, uncertain sort of income, a fluctuating income like any self-employed person. With good and bad, one of my books was on the Year 12 reading list for 4 years, The Divine Wind, and that single book kept me alive for 4 years, the income from that book, but then it went off the reading list and I was broke again. But that's what I'm used to. I wouldn't have it any other way. Reading is vital to me as a writer, and I think I would suggest to all aspiring writers that they should be readers. I read a lot. I tend to get up around about 4 o'clock in the morning and read for 2 hours. It's just my body clock is set that way, and I can get an enormous amount of reading done that way until the family gets up afterwards. I read critically sometimes if a book is bad, but if a book is good, I read for the enjoyment of it. I read critically when the book is bad. And I try to learn from the mistakes of other writers, but I also try to learn when a book is working well, that a book I admire. I try to work out how the writer did it. Not because I want to copy it necessarily, but I might learn something about a technique or an approach. Or a structural approach, for example, or a voice. I learn from my reading all the time. Getting a lot harder in the Australian climate now to get published, although I think electronic publishing may change that over time. But I would never say that to a new writer who's got a burning desire to write that they shouldn't write. I think if someone has a desire to write, and is willing to learn from their mistakes, is willing to learn from an editor, is willing perhaps to do a course, and I would say that only 1 year of a course would be enough, and also has persistence, can gradually make it as a writer. I think it used to distress me to have some of my very good students, some of whom were better writers than me, send a short story off to a magazine, get it rejected, and then quit writing completely, never write again because they felt that they were a failure. You need that persistence. You need to send it out several times. If it comes back, you might think it might need some reworking or whatever, but you need a thick skin and persistence as much as you need talent. I suppose in personal or professional terms, I've noticed over the years that I do tend to get typecast as a crime writer or a children's writer when I have written so-called literary novels, one of which was nominated for the Booker Prize in England, for example, but a lot of those books, it seems to me, have sunk without trace, and I get branded as a crime writer or children's writer, and it's seen too that these are lesser forms of writing. But I spent as much time and craft in writing a crime novel or a children's novel as I do one of my literary novels. I'd like that recognised, and I would also like the value of crime fiction in general to be acknowledged, that crime fiction is not merely a book that you can fingerprint with sunblock in summer and toss aside after you've read it, that a good crime novel tells us about the world we live in, tells us about human nature, and in many ways literary fiction has let us down on that front.